Hello everybody, and welcome to my video explaining my attempt to recreate the Baba O'Reilly background synthesizer sound using all free software. A little bit of quick background. I am new to virtual synthesizers or synthesizers in general, and I wanted a project that I could attempt to learn on. Being a beginner, my first thought was to start at the very beginning. I tried to think of what the very first song that I could remember that had a synthesizer in it. The very first one I remember, first band I remember to use one was the Monkees. Mickey Dolenz had purchased one of the very first Moog synthesizers. His, I believe, was actually number 3. And they had used it on a couple of tracks on an album in 1967. The 2 tracks were Daily Nightly and Star Collector. But as I began to research those songs, I realized that the guitar part in both songs provided by Mike Nesmith and the organic keyboards provided by Peter Tork, along with the bass, which is provided by Chip Douglas, Peter Tork being busy with the organic keyboards, seemed to really hold the core of both of those songs. And the synthesizer in the case of Daily Nightly was really used to add to the psychedelic feel they were going for in that track. And in the case of Star Collector, it seemed like they were using the song as a vehicle for some of the sonic experimentation they were working on. But in both cases, it didn't seem like the synthesizer part could stand alone. The core of the song is really held in the more traditional instruments. So I decided to change my plan and go with the earliest song I could think of that had a synthesizer as part of the core of the song. And that took me forward a few years to the Who's Next album. Again, 2 songs on that album, Won't Get Fooled Again and Baba O'Reilly. This particular video is Baba O'Reilly. I did attempt Won't Get Fooled Again also. If people are interested, I may make a video of that later on. So in researching this, I found that when Pete Townsend wrote those songs, he actually had used a Lowry organ with an EMS synthesizer sitting on top of it, running the output of the organ into the synthesizer. However, he shortly after that purchased a larger synthesizer. I believe it was an ARP 2600, and that is what he used to create the demo. And I found that there was a website called VST4 with the number 4 free that had quite a selection available. As I researched them, I ended up liking the modular type synthesizer better than some of the others that were available. It's more versatile that you can put in the specific components that you want. The specific one I ended up using is called Modulaire. I have it here running through Savvy Host, which is a modification of VST Host, which is, both of them are free and allows you to run one VST in a live format. I also have the option that gives you the keyboard down here at the bottom, although when I did this I actually used an external keyboard, but for this particular video I'm using the one on screen. So let's get to actually creating the sound using Modulaire. Initially I went ahead and used 4 oscillators. Modulaire has an option of a single oscillator or a dual oscillator, which is essentially 2 oscillators in one module. There are a few slight differences between these. Some of the waveform options are different, some of the other options are different, but they're very similar. In this case, we're going to go ahead and use a total of 4 using 2 singles and 1 double. We're also going to use 2 amplifiers, but to start with we're just going to use 1, and we'll eventually add that other one. And of course an ADSR, but in this particular VST the ADSR is built into the output, so you don't have to add another module for that. The ADSR settings are just going to be 0 attack, 0 decay, full sustain, 0 release. So just when you hit the key you get the sound, let off the key, the sound goes away. Now for this first one we're going to go ahead and add it to amplifier A. So now we have the output of oscillator 1 going to amplifier A. You can see if we highlight an input, it shows us where it comes from, just mousing over it. And we're going to, for now, we're going to have the output actually be the left and right of amplifier 1. Okay, so now we have oscillator going into 1A and the amplifier output going to the output option. And if we press key, we should get a sound, which we do. So that's our first oscillator. Now our second one, and trying to recreate our organ sound, we're going to go ahead and put that into input B on amplifier 1 with oscillator 2, which should give us essentially the same sound again, just a little more of it. We got 2 oscillators doing it, right? But what we're going to do now to thicken this up a little bit is just detune oscillator 2 down to about, say, -7. And now we should get a much thicker tone out of it. There we go. Now that gives us our first 2 oscillators. Now our second 2 we're going to run to amplifier 2, which are the dual oscillators. So dual oscillator A, we're going to put there, and doing the dual oscillator B we'll put in amplifier 2B. However, our output right now is just the amplifier 1. That's all we have is left and right, so we won't hear anything that we put in 2 right now. But this particular VST has a thing called a blender as an option. What that allows you to do is take 2 outputs and make them 1. So since we have 4, we're going to try to make them 2 using a blender. And there's 2 blenders on the blender module. So there's an A and a B. So we're going to take the left side of amplifier A, or amplifier 1, and put it on one side of the blender, and then we'll take the left side of amplifier 2 and put it on the other side of the blender. So now the output of blender A will be the left channels of both amplifiers. And now we'll do the rights on B. Now we have both of them coming out of the blender. So now we just make the output, instead of that, we make the output blender A for the left channel and blender B for the right channel. And now we should have both amplifiers all mixed. However, currently we would still only hear amplifier 1 because the blenders are set at 0. To get an equal amount coming from each leg going into the blender, we have to set this at 50. So we'll set each of these to 50. And now we should be adding our amplifier 2A, which is coming from oscillator A, dual oscillator A, which sounds relatively the same because we haven't changed anything. But now what we're going to do is we're going to raise the pitch on this one up a fifth. Then give us a little more of an organ sound. And a fifth is actually 7 on the pitch knob. So now that this one's up a fifth, we should hear a different sound. There we go. Now we have a different sound to it, getting a little closer to an organ. And for the last one, we're going to add, again, dual oscillator B to amplifier 2B. And we're going to pitch that up an octave, which is a 12 on the pitch knob. So now that one will be an octave higher, and they'll all be blended. And we get a sound that sounds similar to a synthesized organ. So now our next piece is to add the sequencer. In this particular song, it is a 8 sequence loop. So we're going to add the sequencer, and this one by default is 8. It's actually, in this particular song, is actually 4 pairs to get the sound we're looking for. It automatically defaults to 8. You can use less by changing this number, or you can use more by linking it to another sequencer. But in this case, we just need the 1, and we're going to set it to 8. And we're going to set the clock to be 16th notes, because that's what we need for this particular song. And now we are going to use the sequencer to modify our oscillators, so that will change our tone in the sequential order that we need it to. Now, I found out when researching this or listening to it that the entire song is a little sharp. It's actually pitched a little sharp. So we're not going to leave our root note at 0. We're going to raise it up just a little bit, about 12 to 13, somewhere around there. Okay, so we got those at 12, or 0.12 actually, not 12, 0.12. Our next sequence should be 488. Again, we're doing this in pairs because that's the way the song is written. So we're going to set 2 of them to 488. Now our next one should be 613. That should give us our top notes. Okay, so those two are now 613, and then on our way back down, we got to go back to 488 again for our last pair. So now we should have our sequence set. We have our time using the clock, and we have our pairs tuned up to where it should make the proper changes to the notes. So now we have to apply that modification to our oscillators. So we are going to do a modulator of a sequencer here on each of these oscillators and on the dual, both sides of the dual oscillator. So now we should have them all modified with the sequencer. And in this case, we want the entire thing to be modified. So we're going to turn the modulator switch or knob all the way to max, which is 4 on each one of these. So now we should have our sequence completed. Now if we play the note, it should go through the sequence and make the appropriate changes to the tone, which it does. So we have the sound now, we have the tones that we need, but now we have to add the waveform because all it's doing now is just changing tones. It's not, there's no wave involved in it. So we're going to use an LFO, a low frequency oscillator, as a modulator. And again, we're going to use a dual, kind of the same thing where there's 2 on 1, to modify the sound coming out to properly add the wave to the sound. Now in this case, I'm going to go ahead and start with a sine wave, and we're not going to use the rate buttons. We're just going to go ahead and sync it to 16th notes so it'll override the actual rate knobs here. We'll set these at 16ths. And with Savvy Host, you can set the actual beats per minute up here at the top. I have it set at 120. So that's what gives you your 16th notes based on 120 beats per minute. So now we're using a sine wave on this particular one, and we're going to go ahead and use this to modify the output of the amplifiers. So again, down here we're going to do add in the modulator slot, the LFO, but we only want the positive side of the wave. We don't want to go below 0. We only want the positive side. So in this case, we're going to use LFO positive, LFO-A positive. And the same thing here. And the same thing here. And here for the last one. So now that we've got the 16th notes and we have this modified, we should get our sound once we turn these up. Again, the modulator knobs have to be turned all the way up because we want to modulate it completely. So these will go all the way up to 1. And now that should make the change to our sequence using 16th notes so that it's all synced up. Now we play our note, and we're getting pretty close. We're getting pretty close to the sound we were looking for. We actually now have the wave and we have the sequence going. But one thing I noticed about this song is that it has a very slight, almost like a pick sound at the beginning of each note, but it's very slight. And a lot of times when people have tried to recreate this, it seems to go too much. It has too much of a pick sound at the beginning, and I was trying to get a little bit of it without too much of it. Using a sine wave, it's gone altogether. It has kind of almost like a fade-in feel to it. So to give a little bit of that, I went ahead and used the second side of this LFO, but I changed it to a saw down. Now if you use a saw down just on this one, straight, where all ours are, then it sounds two-picked. Doesn't give you the right beginning of each change. So to make that slight, I left this as a sine wave, used a saw down here, and only changed the octave side of our amplifier. Right? So this particular one, we're going to use, instead of A, we're going to use LFO B positive, which gives us just a little bit of that saw down wave, but still most of it running through the sine wave. And it gets pretty close to the sound we're looking for. The only other thing I did was I went ahead and added a reverb to give it just a little bit of echo feel if you want it. Went ahead and turn this down just for the example all the way to dry. Now what I did here is I went ahead and took the output of the blender and put it into the reverb. Both sides, or both parts of the blender, it has two in the one module. And then it used the output as the left and right side of the reverb. Okay, so now we should essentially have the same sound, which we do, but now we can mix in a little bit of reverb if we want. Just giving it a little bit of echo, a little slight background. I didn't mention earlier that the waveform for the oscillators is saw. I did try a sine wave, which is probably a little closer to an actual organ, but using the different waveforms, it seemed that saw actually got the result that was the closest to the Bubba O'Reilly background sound. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope it was useful to you. Let me know if there's some interest in the Won't Get Fooled Again attempt using the same free software, and thanks for watching.